The man sitting in his gray van outside Lincoln High School had been exiled from the Iron Circle 4 years ago for something so violent that nobody in the club spoke his name out loud anymore. But 12-year-old Michelle Voss didn't know any of that. All she knew was that for 7 straight days, the same van parked in the same spot, and the same pair of dead eyes tracked the same girl walking out the front doors. What Michelle did next would shatter the silence of an entire motorcycle brotherhood and drag a father's oldest nightmare back from the grave. This story will test everything you think you know about protection, about family, and about the people society throws away. Stay with me all the way to the end. I promise you, this one hits different. Drop a like right now, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. But the fluorescent tube above the third bay had been flickering for 11 days. Nobody fixed it. That was how things worked inside the Iron Circle's garage. Everything that wasn't an engine or a tire got ignored until it either died on its own or somebody tripped over it in the dark. The light buzzed and stuttered, throwing a sick yellow pulse across the oil-stained concrete floor, across the gutted frame of a '94 Softail that Roach had been picking apart since August, across the row of boots lined up beneath the workbench, like soldiers waiting for orders that never came. It was the kind of evening that didn't want to end. October air pushed through the half-open bay door, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and dead leaves, and something metallic that might have been the river 3 miles south. 6 men sat scattered across the garage in various states of exhaustion. 2 played cards on an overturned oil drum. 1 slept in a folding chair with his arms crossed over a leather cut so worn the stitching had gone white at the shoulders. The rest just existed, drinking coffee from styrofoam cups, staring at nothing, letting the silence do what silence does inside a room full of men who've learned that talking about pain doesn't make it smaller. Aiden Cross sat at the far end of the garage on a wooden stool that had lost one of its rubber feet, so it rocked slightly every time he shifted his weight. He was 44. He looked 50. His hands were wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but he kept holding it because holding something was better than holding nothing. His face was the kind of face that had been carved by years of not sleeping. Deep lines around the mouth, a permanent crease between the eyebrows, eyes that looked at you but always seemed to be calculating the distance to the nearest exit. He was the president of the Iron Circle, and he wore that title the way some men wear a scar they got in a fight they didn't start. Not with pride, not with shame, just with the quiet understanding that it was there, and it wasn't going anywhere. And talking about it wouldn't change a damn thing. The girl appeared at the edge of the bay door like a ghost that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be seen. She was small. Not just young small, but survival small. The kind of thin that comes from learning early that taking up space gets you noticed, and getting noticed gets you hurt. Her jacket was too big. Her shoes were wrong for the weather. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that looked like she'd done it herself in the dark, which she probably had. She stood in the gap between the door and the wall with her hands shoved deep into her pockets and her eyes moving across the room the way a rabbit scans a field before crossing it. Nobody noticed her for almost a full minute. That was her skill. That was the thing foster care had taught her better than any classroom ever could. How to be in a room without being in a room. How to watch without being watched. How to stand 3 feet from a grown man and remain completely invisible. It was Roach who saw her first. He was reaching for a socket wrench on the pegboard when his hand stopped midair and his head turned and he said, "Real quiet, Aiden." Aiden looked up. The stool rocked. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She just stood there, 12 years old, breathing through her mouth because her nose was stuffed from the cold, and she said, "I need to tell somebody something." The garage went still. Not quiet. It was already quiet. But still. The kind of still that happens when every man in a room full of men simultaneously registers that a child has walked into a place where children don't belong, and the math of that equation only has bad answers. Aiden set the coffee cup down on the edge of the workbench. It almost tipped. He didn't fix it. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was flat. Not unkind, but flat. The voice of a man who had trained himself to keep everything level because the one time he let it tip, somebody got hurt. "No," the girl said. "I know exactly where I am." Her name was Michelle Voss. She was 12. She had been in the foster system since she was 6, bounced through 4 homes in 3 counties, pulled from the last one after a neighbor called about screaming that turned out to be a television set turned up too loud to cover the screaming. She was enrolled at Lincoln High's middle school annex. She had no friends. She had no phone. She had a library card and a pair of eyes that never stopped working. She told them what she had seen. For 1 week, 7 days, Monday through Sunday, she had watched a man in a gray van park on the east side of Elm Street, 2 blocks from the school's main entrance between 3:10 and 3:15 in the afternoon. Every day, same spot, same van, same man. He never got out. He never made a call. He just sat behind the wheel with the window cracked 2 inches and watched. And every day the person he watched was the same. A 16-year-old girl with dark hair who walked out the front doors at 3:22, turned left, crossed at the Walgreens intersection, and disappeared down Birch Avenue toward the east side of town. Michelle described the man. Tall, heavy through the shoulders, a scar that ran from the left side of his jaw down into the collar of his shirt, and a tattoo on his right forearm. A snake coiled around a dagger, the ink faded green the way old prison tattoos fade when the skin stretches over time. She described it calmly, precisely. The way a person describes something when they have rehearsed it in their head 40 times because they knew they would only get one chance to say it, and nobody ever listens to foster kids the first time. The room didn't breathe. Aiden's hands had stopped moving. The coffee cup sat forgotten on the bench. Every muscle in his face had locked into something that wasn't an expression. It was the absence of one. The kind of blankness that only comes when a man's brain is moving so fast that his face can't keep up. "The girl," he said. "Describe her." Dark hair, ponytail. She carries a green backpack with a patch on the front pocket. Some kind of band logo. She walks fast, like she doesn't want to be outside longer than she has to. Aiden's jaw tightened. The stool rocked once and went still. "That's my daughter." The words came out like stones dropped into water, heavy, final, sinking into the silence of the garage and pulling everything down with them. The girl he was describing was Sadie Cole, 16, junior at Lincoln High. She used her mother's maiden name because her mother was dead, and using the dead woman's name was the only piece of her Sadie could carry without asking her father's permission. She had her mother's jaw, her mother's walk, her mother's talent for making a room feel colder just by being disappointed in it. Aiden and Sadie hadn't had a real conversation in 14 months. They lived in the same house the way strangers live in the same motel, sharing walls, sharing plumbing, sharing nothing else. He left money on the kitchen counter. She left silence in every room she entered. The grief had built a wall between them so high that neither one could see over it anymore. And after a while, they both stopped trying. But the tattoo, the scar, the gray van, every man in the garage knew what those details meant. A few of them closed their eyes. One of them, a thick-necked man named Dutch, who had been with the club for 19 years, stood up from the card game and walked to the bay door and stared out at the dark street like he was waiting for something to come out of it. The name nobody said out loud was Calder Vance. 4 years ago, Calder had been a patched member of the Iron Circle. He was the kind of man who joined a brotherhood not because he believed in it, but because he needed something to stand behind while he did whatever he wanted. He was smart, charming when he needed to be, violent when he didn't need to be. He had a talent for finding the exact pressure point in any situation and leaning on it until something broke. What broke was a woman named Denise Farrow. She was the sister of another club member. Calder had been seeing her for 3 months when the bruises started showing up in places where bruises don't come from falling. By the time the club found out, Denise had a fractured cheekbone and a fear of closed doors that would follow her for the rest of her life. The Iron Circle handled it the way they handled things that fell outside the reach of law, quietly, permanently, and without paperwork. They stripped Calder's patch. They broke 2 of his ribs in the parking lot behind the garage. And they told him that if he ever came within 50 miles of the club or anyone connected to it, the next conversation would happen in a place where nobody could hear him answer. Calder vanished. For 4 years, his name was just a bad taste in the back of the club's collective memory. Now he was parked outside a high school, watching Aiden's daughter. Aiden turned to Michelle. His face was still locked. His voice was still level. But something behind his eyes had shifted. Something old and heavy and dangerous, like a machine that had been turned off for years and was now slowly grinding back to life. "How did you find us?" he asked. "I followed the bikes," Michelle said. "Last Tuesday, I saw two of your guys at the gas station on Route 9. I remembered the jackets, the logo. I walked here from the group home. Took me about 40 minutes. You walked 40 minutes in the dark to tell strangers that a man is watching a girl you don't know. Nobody else was going to do it." That sentence landed in the room like a brick through a window. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Because every man in that garage had lived some version of that exact sentence. The version where nobody comes, nobody listens, nobody does a damn thing, and you either learn to handle it yourself or you learn to live with the bruise. Aiden looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Dutch. Then he looked at the floor. "Roach," he said, get her something to eat, something hot." Roach moved without asking questions. He disappeared through the side door that connected the garage to the small kitchen where the club kept a coffee maker, a microwave, and a refrigerator that smelled like regret. Michelle followed him, but she looked back once over her shoulder at Aiden, and the look on her face wasn't fear. It was the look of someone who had just put a loaded weapon on a table and was waiting to see who would pick it up. The moment she was gone, the garage changed. The card game was over. The sleeping man was awake. Dutch closed the bay door, and the night disappeared behind corrugated steel. Aiden stood. The stool scraped against concrete. "I want eyes on Sadi tomorrow," he said. "Morning, afternoon. I want to know every step she takes between the front door and the school and back again. I want a visual on that van. License plate, parking pattern, everything. Nobody approaches. Nobody engages. We watch." "And if it's him?" Dutch asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. "Then we figure out what he wants," Aiden said, "and we take it away from him." The surveillance started the next morning. They did it the way the Iron Circle did everything. Without noise, without paperwork, and without telling the person they were protecting. Sadi had no idea. She walked to school the way she always did. Headphones in, eyes forward, shoulders pulled tight against the October wind, and she never once looked at the blue pickup parked 3 blocks behind her with Roach behind the wheel and a pair of binoculars on the passenger seat. Dutch took the afternoon shift. He sat in the parking lot of a laundromat across from the school's east entrance with a newspaper he didn't read and a coffee he didn't drink. At 3:12, the gray van pulled into the same spot Michelle had described. Same angle, same distance, same cracked window. Dutch photographed the plate. He photographed the man. He photographed the way Calder's head turned, slow and mechanical, following Sadi as she walked out the doors and turned left and crossed at the Walgreens intersection and disappeared down Birch Avenue. 3 days of surveillance confirmed what Michelle had reported. Calder Vance was not passing through. He was not lost. He was studying Sadi Cole the way a predator studies a trail. Patiently, methodically, memorizing every detail until the pattern became as familiar as breathing. Each evening, the men returned to the garage and laid out what they'd seen. Photographs pinned to the corkboard above the workbench. Times written on index cards. Routes drawn on a gas station map of the town with red marker that bled through the paper. The picture built itself slowly, and each new piece made the room feel smaller. What nobody said, what everyone thought, was the question underneath all the others. Why Sadi? What did Calder want with the daughter of the man whose club had broken his ribs and stripped his patch and sent him into the dark? The answer sat in the room like a shadow. Revenge. During those 3 days, something else happened that nobody planned. Michelle kept coming back. She showed up each evening around 6, walking the 40 minutes from the group home in shoes that were starting to split at the sole. She didn't ask permission. She just appeared at the bay door and waited until someone noticed, and then she sat in the corner on a milk crate and watched the men work. She was quiet. Impossibly quiet. But she watched everything. She memorized names without being told them. She noticed when Roach's shoulder was bothering him and brought him a bag of ice from the kitchen without being asked. She noticed when Dutch's reading glasses were sitting on the wrong bench and moved them before he spent 20 minutes looking. She moved through the garage like a small, silent current of awareness, and the men responded to her the way wolves respond to a pup that wanders into the den, with a wary, instinctive protectiveness that none of them would have been able to name if you'd asked them to. Aiden noticed too. He watched Michelle the way he used to watch Sadi when she was small. Before the grief, before the silence, before the wall. He saw the way she held her fork, curled tight in her fist like someone might take it. He saw the way she sat with her back against the wall, always, never in the center of a room. He saw the scars on her forearms that she kept covered with sleeves too long for her arms, and he recognized them the way you recognize a language you haven't spoken in years but never forgot. He didn't say anything about it, not yet. But on the third night, when Michelle was leaving, he walked her to the door and said, "You need a ride back?" "I'm fine." That wasn't what I asked. She looked up at him. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, throwing their shadows long and broken across the floor. "Okay," she said. He drove her back to the group home in his truck. They didn't talk. The radio was off. The heater rattled. When they pulled up to the curb, Michelle opened the door and then stopped and said, without turning around, "She's lucky. Your daughter, she doesn't know it, but she's lucky." Then she was gone, swallowed by the porch light and the front door and the system that had been swallowing her for 6 years. Aiden sat in the truck for a long time after that, engine running, hands on the wheel, staring at the house where a 12-year-old girl slept in a bed that wasn't hers, in a room that wasn't hers, in a life that nobody had bothered to make hers. He thought about Sadi, about the 14 months of silence, about the money on the counter and the empty kitchen table and the way grief had turned him into exactly the kind of father he'd sworn he would never become, present in the house, absent in the life. By the fourth day, the surveillance had painted a complete picture. Calder's schedule, his approach routes, the van's registration, which came back to a rental company in a town 90 miles east. He was careful, patient, operating on a timeline that only he could see. That afternoon, Aiden made a decision he had been avoiding. He left the garage at 4 o'clock, drove to the house on Birch Avenue, and sat in the kitchen waiting for his daughter to come home. She walked in at 4:38, dropped her backpack on the floor by the door, saw him sitting at the table, stopped. The kitchen was small, yellow light from a fixture that needed a new bulb, a sink with 2 plates in it, a calendar on the wall still showing August because nobody had turned the page. "What?" Sadi said. Not a question. A wall. "Sit down. I have homework." "Sit down, Sadi." Something in his voice made her stop. Not the words. She'd heard those words 100 times and ignored them every time. It was the thing underneath the words. The thing that sounded like the voice of a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't back away from. She sat. Aiden told her. All of it. The van, the man, the tattoo, the surveillance, the name Calder Vance, which she had never heard before because Aiden had built an entire wall between his club life and his daughter's life, and had spent years believing that wall would hold. He watched her face as he spoke. He watched the confusion turn to disbelief. The disbelief turned to anger. The anger turned to something older and deeper and harder to name. "How long has he been watching me?" she asked. "At least a week, probably longer." "And you knew?" "I found out 4 days ago." 4 days? She stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. 4 days you knew someone was following me, and you didn't say anything. I needed to confirm. You needed to confirm. Her voice was shaking now, not with fear, with something she had been carrying for 14 months, something that had nothing to do with Calder Vance and everything to do with the man sitting across from her. You always need to confirm. You always need more time. You always need to wait. That's what you do, Dad. You wait. You waited when Mom was sick. You waited when she was dying. You waited until it was too late to say anything that mattered, and then you sat in this kitchen and you waited some more. The words hit Aiden like fists, each one precise, each one earned. Sadi. Don't. She held up her hand. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was locked. You don't get to say my name like that. You don't get to sit here after 14 months of nothing and pretend that telling me a stalker is outside my school means you're finally being a father. She grabbed her backpack and walked out. The front door closed. Not slammed, closed. Which was worse. Aiden sat in the yellow kitchen light with the sound of the refrigerator humming and the calendar still showing August, and the absolute certainty that his daughter was right about everything she had said. He had waited. He had always waited. He waited because moving meant feeling, and feeling meant remembering. And remembering meant standing in a hospital room watching the only woman he'd ever loved stop breathing while machines beeped and doctors spoke in voices designed to deliver devastation without raising their blood pressure. He put his hands flat on the table, closed his eyes, breathed. Then he stood up, picked up his keys, and drove back to the garage. What nobody knew yet was that when Sadi opened her locker the next morning, a folded note would be waiting inside. No signature, no return address, just 6 words written in handwriting that looked like it had been pressed into the paper hard enough to tear it. 6 words that would change everything. I can get to you anytime. Sadi's hands were shaking when she pulled the note from her locker. Not the kind of shaking that comes from cold. Lincoln High kept the hallways at 72 degrees year-round because the boiler system only had 2 settings, too hot and broken. This was the other kind. The kind that starts somewhere behind the ribs and works its way outward through the blood until it reaches the fingers and turns them into something that doesn't feel like yours anymore. She read the 6 words 3 times. The paper was white, unlined, torn from something larger. The handwriting was heavy, angular, pressed so deep into the surface that she could feel the grooves with her thumb when she turned it over. No signature, no drawing, no other mark. Just the words sitting on the paper like a wound that hadn't started bleeding yet. I can get to you any time. The hallway was full of noise, lockers slamming, sneakers on linoleum, 2 freshmen arguing about something that wouldn't matter in 6 hours, a teacher's voice leaking through a classroom door, flat and mechanical, explaining something about the Civil War that everyone would forget by Friday. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The sounds of a world that hadn't changed. But Sadi's world had changed. It had changed 4 days ago when her father sat in the kitchen and spoke the name Calder Vance, and it had changed again 30 seconds ago when she opened a locker that was supposed to be locked and found proof that the man watching her from a gray van could reach her in places she thought were sealed. She folded the note, put it in her jacket pocket, closed the locker, walked to first period, sat down, took out her textbook, opened it to the wrong chapter, stared at the page without reading a single word for 47 minutes. At 3:22, she didn't walk her usual route. She turned right instead of left, cut through the faculty parking lot, crossed behind the gymnasium, and walked 6 blocks east to the Iron Circle's garage. She had never been there. Aiden had made sure of that. His club was a door he walked through when he left the house, and whatever happened on the other side of that door stayed there, sealed behind engine noise and cigarette smoke, and the unspoken agreement between a father and daughter that some rooms are not meant to be shared. But Sadi was done with sealed rooms. The bay door was open. 3 bikes sat in a row on the left side. 2 Softails and a Road King with a dented tank that someone had been sanding by hand. The fluorescent light was still flickering. The smell hit her before anything else. Oil and coffee and cold metal, and something underneath all of it that was just the smell of men who had been sitting in the same room for too long without opening a window. Roach saw her first. He was holding a ratchet in one hand and a rag in the other, and when he looked up and saw her standing in the bay door, his hand stopped mid-turn, and his mouth opened and closed and opened again like a man trying to remember a word he'd known 5 seconds ago. "Where's my father?" Sadi said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand shaped like a sentence, and every man in the garage heard the difference. Aiden came out of the back office. He was holding a cell phone in his right hand and a map printout in his left, and when he saw Sadi, his feet stopped moving and the map crinkled in his grip, and for just a second, half a second, maybe less, something crossed his face that looked like every fear he'd ever had arriving at the same time. "What happened?" he said. Sadi pulled the note from her pocket and held it out. She didn't walk toward him. She made him come to her. Made him cross the garage floor with his boots heavy on the concrete and his shadow stretching long under the fluorescent light until he was close enough to take the paper from her fingers. He read it. His jaw worked. The tendons in his neck pulled tight, then tighter, then locked into cords that looked like cables beneath his skin. "Where was this?" he said. "Inside my locker. Combination lock. Locker number 417, second floor, east hallway. Nobody has that combination except me in the front office." Aiden read the note again. Then he folded it along the original crease and held it at his side and stared at the wall behind his daughter's head, for a long time without blinking. Dutch stepped forward from the workbench. He moved slow, the way big men move when they're trying not to make a room feel smaller. His voice was low. He got inside the school. He got inside a locked locker inside the school, Roach corrected. That's not a walkthrough. That's preparation. The word hung in the air. Preparation. It meant planning. It meant tools. It meant Calder Vance had stood in a hallway full of children and worked a combination lock or picked it or convinced someone to open it, and none of the adults paid to watch those hallways had noticed a thing. Aiden turned to a man sitting on a stool near the pegboard wall. His name was Harlan. He was 56 years old with a beard that had gone gray at the edges and hands that looked like they'd been built to hold things that were heavier than they should be. He was the club's sergeant-at-arms, which meant that when decisions were made about safety, his voice carried weight that most men's didn't. Options, Aiden said. Harlan didn't answer right away. He rubbed his thumb along the side of his jaw, slow and deliberate, the way a man rubs a sore tooth he knows needs pulling but isn't ready to lose. School won't help, Harlan said. You walk into that office and tell them a convicted violent offender broke into a student's locker. First thing they do is call the police. Police take a report. Report goes in a file. File sits in a drawer. 30 days from now, if he hasn't done anything else, they close it. Restraining order, Sadi said. Every head in the garage turned toward her, not because the suggestion was wrong, because it was the exact kind of suggestion that the normal world offered. The clean, legal, proper channel kind of answer that sounded reasonable in a courtroom but evaporated the second you stepped outside. I had a restraining order, Dutch said quietly, when my ex-wife's boyfriend was coming around. Piece of paper. Judge signed it. Real official. He paused, looked at the floor. He came back 3 days later, kicked in the side door while my kids were eating dinner. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something too heavy to carry with words. Sadi looked at her father. For the first time since walking into the garage, the anger in her face softened into something else. Not forgiveness. That was still miles away. But recognition. The slow, painful understanding that the world she'd been living in, the world of combination locks and school hallways, and the assumption that walls keep people out, was thinner than she'd ever wanted to believe. So what do we do? She said. Aiden opened his mouth, but before he could answer, another voice cut through the garage. Sharp, sudden, coming from the bay door like a knife through fabric. You don't do anything. The man standing in the doorway was lean and hard, mid-30s, with a cut that had a different bottom rocker than the others. His name was Teague. He was the Iron Circle's vice president, which meant he was the man who spoke the things Aiden was too careful to say. And he was also the man who pushed back hardest when Aiden's careful wasn't careful enough. Teague walked in with his hands in the pockets of his jacket and his eyes locked on Sadi the way you lock eyes with something that shouldn't be in a room you consider yours. She shouldn't be here, Teague said. She's here, Aiden replied. And tomorrow? She here tomorrow too, and the day after that? Because that's how it starts, Aiden. That's how every mess the club's ever been in starts. Somebody brings their personal into the house, and the rest of us end up bleeding for it. The words were blunt, brutal, and not entirely wrong, which was the part that made them dangerous. Teague looked around the garage, made eye contact with Roach, with Harlan, with the 3 other men sitting along the back wall who hadn't spoken yet, but whose silence was its own kind of vote. 4 years ago we put Calder down, Teague said. We stripped his patch. We made it clear. And it was clean. It was done. Nobody came looking. Nobody asked questions. Because we handled it inside and we kept it inside. He pointed at Sadi without looking at her. Now he's back. And the reason he's back is standing right there. He's not coming for the club. He's coming for her. Because she's Aiden's. Which means she's ours, Harlan said. No. Teague's voice didn't rise. It sharpened. She's Aiden's. There's a difference. And if we forget that difference, if we turn this club into a personal security detail for one man's family, then we stop being what we are. And what are we? Dutch asked. His voice was quiet. Dangerous quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before a man decides that talking isn't getting the job done anymore. Teague met his eyes, held them, didn't flinch. We're a brotherhood, not a family. Brotherhood means every man at the table carries the same weight. It means we don't bleed for one man's fight unless every man votes to pick it up. Aiden's hands were at his sides. His fingers weren't clenched. They were open, hanging loose, which was somehow worse. It meant he was controlling something that wanted very badly to not be controlled. You want to vote, Aiden said. Fine. We vote. Tonight. Full table. Tonight's too soon. Half the guys are... Tonight. Aiden's voice cut clean. Midnight. Every patch in this room and every patch not in this room. You want to put it to the table, Teague, then we put it to the table. But you look at my daughter one more time like she's a problem that walked in off the street, and you and I are going to have a conversation that doesn't involve a vote. The air between the two men condensed into something almost visible. Two wills pushing against each other, neither one bending, the pressure building in the space between their chests like a storm that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to break. Teague looked away first. Not down. Away. It was the difference between submission and retreat, and every man in the room understood the distinction. Midnight, Teague said. Then he turned and walked out. His boots were heavy on the gravel outside, and then a bike engine turned over, once, twice, catching on the third, and the sound Dopplered down the street and faded into the October dark. Sadie was staring at the spot where Teague had been standing. Her face was blank. Not calm. Blank. The face of someone who has just realized that the people she came to for help are not a single thing but a collection of competing fractures held together by something she doesn't fully understand. He doesn't want to protect me, she said. He wants to protect the club, Aiden said. Isn't that the same thing? Aiden didn't answer. He put his hand on the workbench and leaned into it, and the weight shifted from his legs to his arm, and for just a moment he looked like exactly what he was. A man holding up a building that was trying to fall on him. Michelle arrived at 6:45. Same jacket, same wrong shoes, same 40-minute walk from the group home. She came through the bay door the way she always did, quiet and watchful, and she found a room that felt different from the one she'd been visiting all week. She saw Sadie first. The older girl was sitting on a folding chair near the coffee machine with her arms wrapped around her knees and her chin resting on top of them, and she looked up when Michelle appeared and something passed between them that didn't need words. The recognition of two people who have both spent time in rooms where they weren't wanted. You're the one who told them, Sadie said. Yeah. Why? Michelle sat down on the milk crate across from her, pulled her sleeves over her hands. Thought about it. Because I've been the girl nobody warned, she said, and it sucks. Sadie studied her for a long time. The kind of looking that goes past the face and into the architecture underneath. Then she unfolded one arm and held out her hand, and Michelle took it, and they shook once, firm, like two people signing a contract that nobody else could read. I'm Sadie. Michelle. How old are you? 12. You look 10. I know. The midnight vote happened in the garage with every bay door closed and every light except the one over the main table turned off. 11 men sat around a table that was really just 3 sheets of plywood balanced on sawhorses, and the shadows their bodies threw on the walls made them look like something out of a painting nobody would want to hang in their house. Aiden spoke first. He laid out the situation the way he laid out everything. Flat, stripped of emotion, built on facts. The surveillance, the van, the note, Calder's history, what the police would do, which was nothing fast enough to matter, what the school would do, which was less, what the club could do, which was more but came with weight that every man at the table would carry. Then Teague spoke. He didn't argue against protecting Sadie. He was smarter than that. What he argued against was scope. He used words like exposure and liability and blowback, and each word was a brick placed carefully on the scale opposite Aiden's request. The club had been clean for 4 years. No arrests, no investigations, no trouble from outside. Teague wasn't wrong that engaging with Calder Vance risked all of that. The man is baiting us, Teague said. He wants us to come after him. He wants us to make the first move so he can go to the cops and say the Iron Circle is threatening him. Then the spotlight's on us, our shop, our rides, our records. He looked around the table. Some of you have things you can't afford to have looked at too closely. A ripple went through the room, not a sound, a shift. The subtle movement of men adjusting in their chairs, recalculating, feeling the weight of their own secrets pressing against the weight of Aiden's request. Harlan spoke last. He stood up slowly, the way old trees move in wind, not because they're weak, but because they've learned that speed isn't the same thing as strength. I've been in this club 31 years, he said. I was here before most of you were old enough to hold a wrench. I've watched this table make a lot of decisions, good ones, bad ones. A few that still keep me up at 3 a.m. He paused, rubbed his jaw again. But I've never once sat at this table and voted to leave a child unprotected because it was inconvenient. The vote was 7-4. 7 to engage, 4 against. Teague's 4 sat with their arms crossed and their jaws set and said nothing after the count, which was its own kind of promise. A promise that this wasn't over, that the disagreement had been recorded and would be remembered and would surface again the moment things went sideways. Aiden accepted the vote without celebration. He stood and put both hands flat on the plywood and looked at every face in the room, one at a time, including the 4 who had voted against him. We do this clean, he said. We do this quiet. Surveillance continues. Nobody touches Calder. Nobody talks to him. We watch. We document. We wait for him to make a move that gives us something the law can use. And if the law doesn't use it? Dutch asked. Aiden's eyes dropped to the table. The plywood grain ran in lines that looked like rivers seen from very high up, and he traced one with his thumb before answering. Then we have a different conversation. The meeting broke at 1:40 in the morning. Men filed out into the October cold, breath clouding under the single bulb above the side door, bike engines firing one by one like a sequence of controlled detonations. The sound filled the empty street and bounced off the buildings across the road and faded in layers, the deepest rumble lasting longest, hanging in the air like the memory of something that used to be louder. Teague was the last to leave. He stopped at the bay door and turned back and found Aiden standing alone at the plywood table, staring at the map pinned to the corkboard behind it. 7-4, Teague said. That's not consensus. That's a fracture. It's a majority. Majorities break, Aiden, especially when the cost starts climbing. Then I'll carry the cost. You can't. That's the point. You can't carry it alone, and the minute you try, you stop being a president and start being a liability. Teague's voice had lost its edge. What was left underneath was something rougher and harder to dismiss. Something that sounded almost like concern, buried under years of learning that concern and weakness looked the same from a distance. You love that girl. I know you do. But love is the most dangerous thing a man in your position can carry. It makes you blind. It makes you slow. And it makes you make decisions for her instead of for the 11 men who put their trust in you. He turned and walked out. His bike started on the first kick, which it always did, because Teague maintained his machine the way he maintained everything. Precisely, relentlessly, without sentiment. Aiden stood in the empty garage. The fluorescent light buzzed. The coffee in the pot was cold. The map on the corkboard showed the 6-block radius around Lincoln High School, with Calder's routes marked in red, and the red lines looked like veins carrying something poisonous toward a heart that didn't know it was sick. He pulled out his phone, scrolled to Sadi's name, started a text message, deleted it, started another. Deleted that too. What he wanted to write was, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every morning I left money on the counter instead of leaving words on the table. I'm sorry for the 14 months. I'm sorry your mother died and I couldn't stop it, and I couldn't talk about it, and I couldn't be what you needed because being what you needed meant feeling what I was feeling, and I wasn't strong enough for that. I'm sorry that the only way I know how to love you is to stand between you and the thing that wants to hurt you, and I'm sorry that standing between isn't the same as standing beside. What he actually wrote was, lock your window tonight. He sent it, put the phone down, leaned against the workbench and closed his eyes and listened to the fluorescent tube buzz and stutter and buzz again, and he wondered if Calder was somewhere out there in the dark, listening too. 3 blocks away in a motel room with curtains drawn and a laptop open on the bed, Calder Vance was not listening. He was looking at a photograph. The photograph showed the interior of the Iron Circle's garage, taken through the bay door with a long lens, and in the center of the frame, lit by that same stuttering fluorescent tube, were two faces he recognized. One was Aiden Cross. The other was a girl sitting on a folding chair with her arms wrapped around her knees. Calder set the photograph down, reached for the phone on the nightstand, dialed a number he had memorized but never saved. The voice that answered wasn't his, it was someone else's, someone who had been waiting for the call, someone who spoke in short sentences and asked only one question. "Is the daughter inside the garage?" "Yes." "Good. That changes the timeline." The line went dead. Calder set the phone down and looked at the photograph again, and the smile that crossed his face was the kind of smile that has nothing to do with happiness. It was the smile of a man watching pieces move exactly where he needed them to go. He was not alone in this. He had never been alone in this, and the Iron Circle didn't know. The rain started at 2 a.m. and didn't stop. It came down in sheets against the garage's metal roof, turning the building into a drum that nobody had asked to play, and the sound filled every corner and every silence and made the men inside feel like they were sitting at the bottom of something that was trying to bury them. Aiden hadn't slept. He was standing at the corkboard with a fresh cup of coffee that was already going cold, staring at the map and the red lines and the photographs Dutch had pinned in a row across the top. Calder's face stared back from 5 different angles: gas station, school parking lot, Elm Street, the Walgreens intersection, and one blurred shot from the motel parking lot that Roach had grabbed 2 hours ago on a drive-by. The motel was called the Ridgeline, 14 rooms, single story, off Route 11, 3 miles east of town. Roach had written the room number on a post-it note and stuck it to the bottom of the photograph, room 9. Aiden's phone buzzed on the workbench. He picked it up. Text from Sadi. 2 words, window locked. He put the phone down and went back to staring at the map. The red lines hadn't changed, the photographs hadn't changed, but something in the architecture of the problem had shifted overnight, and he couldn't see it yet. And that was the thing that was keeping him standing at 2 a.m. in a garage that smelled like motor oil and cold rain. The feeling that the picture on the corkboard was incomplete, that he was looking at a jigsaw puzzle with a piece missing from the center, and the missing piece was the one that would make everything else make sense. The phone call. Calder had made a phone call. The information had come from a prospect named Wyatt, who worked nights at the Ridgeline's front desk and owed Dutch a favor large enough that he didn't ask questions when Dutch asked him to keep his eyes open. Wyatt reported that Calder had made a call from the motel room at approximately 1:45 a.m. Short call. Under 2 minutes. Then the light in room 9 went off and stayed off. Under 2 minutes. That's a report, not a conversation. A report is what you give when someone is waiting for information, and the information is binary set. Yes or no, in or out, done or not done. A report means a chain of command. A chain of command means Calder Vance is not the top of whatever this is. Aiden set the coffee cup down on the workbench. Missed the edge. The cup fell and hit the concrete floor and split and spilled brown liquid across the oil stains, and he stood there watching it spread without bending down to pick it up because his mind was somewhere else entirely. He had assumed this was personal. Calder coming back for revenge against the man who broke his ribs and took his patch. A straight line. Simple geometry. One man, one target, one motive. But the phone call broke the line. The phone call bent it into something he couldn't trace with his eyes alone. Who was on the other end? Dutch arrived at 6 a.m., wet from the ride, helmet under one arm, rain dripping off his beard onto the concrete floor. He saw the broken coffee cup, saw Aiden standing at the corkboard, read the situation without asking. You figure something out, or you've just been standing here all night. He's not alone. Dutch stopped mid-step. His boot left a wet print on the concrete that looked like a map of somewhere nobody wanted to go. What do you mean? The phone call. 1:45 a.m., under 2 minutes. He called someone, gave a report. Someone is running him. Dutch processed this the way he processed everything. Slowly, thoroughly, turning it over in his mind like a mechanic turning a part in his hand, checking every angle for cracks. Could be anyone. Lawyer, bail bondsman, girlfriend. At 1:45 in the morning, under 2 minutes, no small talk, no warm-up, just information and a hang-up. Dutch's jaw shifted to the left. His eyes went to the photograph of Calder's face, then to the map, then to the floor. "You're saying he's working for somebody." "I'm saying this doesn't feel like one man with a grudge. This feels like a play, and we're not seeing the whole board." The rain kept hammering. The fluorescent tube buzzed and flickered. Somewhere outside, a truck passed on the wet road with a sound like tearing cloth. And then it was gone, and the rain filled the space it left behind. By mid-morning, Aiden had Roach and a newer member named Collis running a different kind of surveillance. Not on Calder, on the motel. They sat in separate vehicles on opposite ends of Route 11 and watched the Ridgeline's parking lot through binoculars and logged every vehicle that came and went. License plates. Make and model. Time of arrival. Time of departure. At 11:47 a.m., a black sedan pulled into the lot. No markings. Tinted windows. It parked 2 spaces from Calder's gray van and sat there for 6 minutes with the engine running. Then the driver's door opened and a man got out. Medium height, dark coat, no visible tattoos, no visible anything that would make you remember him if you saw him on the street. He walked to room 9, knocked twice. The door opened. He went inside. Collis photographed the plate, photographed the man, photographed the door closing behind him. 14 minutes later, the man came out, got back in the sedan, drove east on Route 11 without signaling, gone. Roach called Aiden. "We got a visitor." "Who?" "Don't know yet. Running the plate now." The plate came back 2 hours later through a connection Harlan had at a body shop that did business with people who didn't always want their business known. The sedan was registered to a company called Linden Property Holdings. The company's registered address was a P.O. box in a town called Carver, 60 miles north. Linden Property Holdings. Aiden wrote the name on the corkboard beneath Calder's photographs and stared at it. The letters didn't mean anything to him. They didn't connect to anything he knew, any name he recognized, any piece of the club's history that he could pull from the shelves of his memory and set down on the table next to the red lines and the photographs. But Harlan recognized it. He came into the garage at 4 p.m., shaking rain off his jacket, and stopped in front of the corkboard and read the name and went very still. The kind of still that Aiden had only seen in Harlan twice in 31 years. Once when they got the call about Denise Farrow, and once when Harlan's own son was killed by a drunk driver on Interstate 90 11 years ago. "Where did you get that name?" Harlan said. "Sedan. Visited Calder's motel room this morning, 14 minutes inside." Harlan's hand came up and gripped the edge of the workbench. His knuckles turned white. The bones showed through the skin like fence posts under snow. "Linden Property Holdings," Harlan said slowly, "is a front company. I know it because I've seen it before. 8 years ago, before you were president, when the club was dealing with a land dispute on Route 4, someone buying up properties around the garage, trying to squeeze us out. The company behind it was Linden." "Who runs it?" Harlan turned and looked at Aiden, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has just opened a door he thought was locked and found something on the other side that should have stayed in the dark. "A man named Ward Sable." The name landed in the garage like a dropped engine block. Heavy, final, cracking the concrete beneath it. Aiden knew the name. Every man in the Iron Circle knew the name, even if most of them had never met the man attached to it. Ward Sable was a property developer who had spent the last 20 years buying land in 3 counties, flipping neighborhoods, and pushing out anyone who stood between him and a profit margin. He operated through layers, shell companies, holding groups, local attorneys who filed paperwork that looked clean from the outside but smelled wrong if you held it up to the light. 8 years ago, Sable had tried to acquire the block where the Iron Circle's garage sat. The land was worth more without a motorcycle club on it, and Sable was the kind of man who solved problems by making them expensive to maintain. Property taxes that suddenly doubled. Health inspections that found violations nobody had ever heard of. Noise complaints filed by addresses that turned out to be vacant lots. The club fought it. They hired a lawyer who cost more than they could afford and won a ruling that kept the garage standing. Sable retreated. The attack stopped. And over the years, the name faded into the background noise of the club's history. Just another rich man who had tried to erase something that refused to be erased. But he hadn't forgotten. "This doesn't make sense," Aiden said. Sable wants the land. He's wanted it for years. Why go through Calder? Why stalk my daughter? Harlan released the workbench. His hand was shaking. Not much, just a tremor, the kind that comes from adrenaline or age or the intersection of both. Because last time he tried to buy us out, and we fought him in court, and we won. He's not making that mistake again. Harlan paused. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. He's not trying to buy us out, Aiden. He's trying to break you, break the president, break the club. No president, no leadership. No leadership, no fight. The garage goes up for sale and he picks it up for nothing. By using Calder to get to Sadi. By using Calder to get to you through Sadi. Calder doesn't care about the land. Calder wants revenge. Sable is funding that revenge because it serves his purpose. They're using each other. The architecture of the thing assembled itself in Aiden's mind like a building going up in time-lapse. Sable at the top, invisible, operating through Linden Property Holdings. Calder at the bottom, visible, operating on his own hatred, but pointed like a weapon at a target Sable had chosen for him. The phone call at 1:45 a.m. was Calder reporting that Sadi had been seen inside the garage. And the response, good, that changes the timeline, meant that Sable now knew the club was gathering around the girl, which meant the club was exactly where he wanted it. Aiden put both hands on the plywood table and leaned into it until the wood creaked. The rain hammered the roof. The light flickered. Somewhere outside, a Harley engine rumbled past on the wet street, its sound deep and guttural, and it faded into the distance like a warning delivered too late. We've been watched, Aiden said. We've been played, Harlan corrected. At 5:30 p.m., Aiden called an emergency meeting. Not at the garage. The garage suddenly felt wrong, exposed, compromised, a place where the walls had eyes they hadn't noticed before. They met instead at a farmhouse 7 miles outside of town that belonged to Dutch's uncle, a man who had died 2 years ago and left behind 20 acres of scrub grass, a well that still worked, and a kitchen table big enough to seat 12 men who had nowhere else safe to go. The farmhouse smelled like dust and old wood, and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco that had seeped into the walls over 50 years. The kitchen light was a single bulb hanging from a cord, and it swung slightly in the draft from the window frame that had warped over time and no longer sealed properly. Rain tapped against the glass in irregular bursts. 9 men around the table. Teague was there. He had come without being asked, which surprised Aiden and didn't surprise anyone else, because whatever Teague was, stubborn, sharp-edged, difficult, he was not the kind of man who disappeared when the ground shifted. Aiden laid it out. Linden Property Holdings. Ward Sable. The connection between the money and the man in the van. The 8-year-old land dispute that nobody had thought about in years, but had apparently never ended. The room listened, the room absorbed, and then the room erupted. We walked right into it, Roach said. His hands were on the table, fingers spread wide, pressing down like he was trying to hold the surface in place. Every day we spent watching Calder. Calder was watching us. Reporting back, feeding Sable information about our movements, our schedule, our numbers. The vote, Teague said. His voice was ice. Flat, clear, sharp enough to draw blood. The vote was part of it. He knew we'd vote. He knew the club would split, 7-4. He knew, because every time this club has ever faced a decision like this, it splits. It always splits. And a split club is a weak club. The men looked at each other. The realization moved through the room like a current, touching each face, each pair of hands, each set of shoulders. They had been moved, positioned, placed on a board they didn't know they were standing on by a hand they couldn't see. Teague leaned forward. His elbows hit the table. His eyes found Aiden. I was right, he said. Not about leaving Sadi unprotected. I was wrong about that. But I was right that this was going to cost us, and I was right that you couldn't see it because you were too close. I see it now. Now might be too late. It's not too late until somebody's in the ground. The sentence fell heavy. Both men held each other's stare across the table, and what passed between them wasn't hostility anymore. It was something harder and more honest. The mutual recognition of 2 men who disagree about method but agree about the stakes, and who know that the difference between those 2 things is the only thing keeping them at the same table. What does Sable want? Collis asked. He was young, 26, patched for 2 years, quiet in meetings because he'd learned that speaking first in a room full of older men was a good way to say something stupid. "The land," Harlan said. "He wants the garage. He wants the block. He's been wanting it for 8 years, and he just found a weapon that might actually get it for him." "Then we give it to him," Collis said. Silence. Every head turned. "The land," Collis continued. "Not the club. The land. We relocate. We take the bikes, the tools, the table, and we set up somewhere else. Sable gets his property. Calder loses his funding. The threat to Saudi evaporates because there's nothing left to fight over." The idea sat on the table like a grenade with the pin half pulled. Some of the men looked at it. Some of them looked away. Dutch stared straight at Collis with an expression that could have been respect or fury, or both. "That garage has been ours for 34 years, Dutch said. "My father helped pour the foundation. Harlan's name is on the lease. Men who aren't alive anymore spent their last good years under that roof. You want to hand it over because some suit with a shell company decided he wants the dirt underneath it?" "I want Saudi Cole to not get hurt," Collis said. "I want that more than I want a building." The room went quiet. Not the angry quiet. The thinking quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a young man says something that every older man in the room was thinking but wouldn't say because saying it felt like surrender. Aiden was the one who broke it. "We're not leaving," he said, "and we're not surrendering. We're going to do something that Sable doesn't expect and Calder isn't prepared for. We're going to end this on our terms." "How?" Teague asked. "We set a trap." The word changed the room. It tightened the air. It straightened the spines of every man at the table and brought the focus to a single sharp point, like a lens catching light. "Calder's been watching Saudi because that's his assignment. Sable needs Calder close to her because that's what keeps the pressure on me, on the club. Take Saudi out of the equation and the whole thing collapses. But we can't hide her. We can't send her away. Calder will follow, and Sable will adjust." "So instead of removing the target," Harlan said slowly, "we use the target. We use the pattern. Calder expects Saudi to walk the same route, same time, every day. He's memorized it. He's built his entire operation around it. So we give him what he expects. But we choose the ground." "You want to use your daughter as bait," Teague said. The word hung in the air, bait. It tasted wrong. It felt wrong. It was wrong in every way that a word can be wrong when it's applied to a 16-year-old girl who had already been through more than most adults survive. "I want to use the route," Aiden said. "Not the girl, the route. We control the path. We control the timing. We choose the street, the lighting, the exits. Every bike in the club positioned before Calder even starts his engine. He follows the pattern because the pattern is all he knows. And when he makes his move, he walks into a circle he can't walk out of." "And Saudi?" "Saudi walks the route. That's the only way it works. If anyone else walks it, he'll know. He's been watching her for weeks. He knows her walk, her pace, her backpack, her ponytail. A substitute doesn't work." Teague's chair scraped back from the table. He stood up, walked to the window, put his hands on the sill and stared out at the rain falling on 20 acres of nothing. "You're asking your daughter to walk into a trap that she might not walk out of. I'm asking my daughter to trust that I'll be there when it matters, for the first time in 14 months, for the first time since her mother died." Aiden's voice cracked. Not a lot, just a hairline fracture, barely visible, but every man in the room heard it, and every man in the room looked away because there are sounds that men in leather don't know how to witness without feeling the weight of their own cracks. "She'll say no," Teague said. "She already said yes." Teague turned from the window. His face was wet. Rain from the cracked seal, maybe, or something else. "When?" "I called her before I called this meeting. Told her everything. Sable. Lyndon. The money. The whole picture." Aiden paused. "She didn't say yes right away. She was quiet for about 30 seconds. And then she said, and this is exactly what she said, 'If I don't do this, he wins. And if he wins, you lose the only thing Mom loved about you.'" The room was silent. The rain on the window was the only sound. The bulb swung on its cord, throwing shadows that moved across the walls like things searching for a place to rest. Harlan broke the silence. "The kid. Michelle. She'll want in. No, Aiden said. She's 12. She's the reason we know about any of this. She found us. She walked 40 minutes in the dark to a room full of strangers because she saw something wrong and nobody else was going to do anything about it. You think she's going to sit in a group home while this goes down? Aiden closed his eyes. Behind his lids, he saw two faces. One was Sadi's, 16, stubborn, carrying a dead woman's name like armor. The other was Michelle's, 12, small, built out of survival instincts and library cards, and a pair of eyes that never stopped working. Two girls. One he had failed by being absent. One the entire world had failed by being indifferent. She watches, Aiden said finally. From a distance, a rooftop, a window, somewhere high with a clear sightline. She has a radio. She reports. That's it. She doesn't come down. She doesn't engage. She watches. She's going to want more than that. She'll take what I give her, because the difference between bravery and stupidity is knowing which fights you're built for, and she's smart enough to know which one she is. Teague came back to the table, sat down, pulled his chair forward until his chest touched the edge. He looked at Aiden across the plywood, and whatever he saw there, the cracked voice, the closed eyes, the weight of a decision that would either save everything or destroy it, made him do something that no one in the room expected. He put his hand out, palm down on the table. The gesture was old, older than the club. It was the gesture that meant I'm in, not because I agree, not because I think this will work, but because I'm in. One by one, the others followed. Hands on the table, palm down. 11 men, scarred and tired and afraid of things they would never say out loud, choosing to step into something that could bury every one of them. Aiden was the last to put his hand down. His palm touched the plywood, and the wood was warm from the others, and for just a moment, just one breath, the room felt like what it was supposed to be. Not a club, not an organization, not a structure with votes and ranks and patches, a family. Broken, fractured, held together with scar tissue and stubbornness, but a family. Friday, Aiden said, we do it Friday. 3 days to prepare. 3 days to position every bike, every man, every exit on the route. 3 days to make sure that when Calder Vance follows my daughter down that street, the last thing he sees before the lights come on is every member of this club standing between him and the only thing I have left in this world. The hands lifted from the table. The men stood. The meeting was over. But as they filed toward the door, Harlan caught Aiden's arm. His grip was tight. His eyes were dark. There's something else you need to know, Harlan said. His voice was low enough that the others couldn't hear it over the scraping of chairs and the sound of jackets being pulled on. What? Ward Sable. The land dispute 8 years ago. I told you we won it in court. You did. What I didn't tell you, what I've never told anyone in this club, is how we won it. Harlan's grip tightened. The lawyer we hired, the one who got us the ruling, he was connected. He had a relationship with the judge, not a legal relationship, a personal one. Money changed hands. Not much. Enough. The floor dropped out from under Aiden's feet. Not physically, but the sensation was the same. The sudden vertiginous feeling of standing on something you thought was solid and realizing it's been hollow the entire time. You bribed a judge, Aiden said. I saved the garage. You bribed a judge and never told the table. Because the table would have voted no. And if the table voted no, we would have lost the garage, and every man who called that building home would have had nowhere to go. Aiden pulled his arm free. He took a step back, then another. The distance between them was only 3 feet, but it felt like the distance between two versions of the same story, the one he'd believed for 8 years and the one he was hearing now. If Sable knows, Aiden said, if he has proof, then the original ruling gets overturned. The garage reverts to the property owner. The club is trespassing on land it doesn't legally occupy. And every man who put his hand on that table tonight is standing on ground that doesn't belong to him. The rain hit the window. The bulb swung. The shadows moved. Aiden stood in the kitchen of a dead man's farmhouse, 3 days from a trap that depended on a club that trusted its own history, and realized that the history was a lie. The ground they were fighting for had been stolen. The ruling they were standing on had been bought. And the man who had just put his hand on the table and pledged to protect Aiden's daughter was the same man who had built the foundation of the club's safety on a secret that could bring the whole structure down. "Does Sable know?" Aiden asked. Harlan's silence was the loudest sound in the room. "Harlan, does Sable know?" "I don't know. But if Calder is working for him, if Sable has spent 4 years planning this, then he's had 4 years to dig. And a man with that kind of money and that kind of patience doesn't stop digging until he finds the bottom." Aiden turned away, walked to the door, put his hand on the frame. The wood was cold and damp and old. Behind him, 11 men were pulling on helmets and starting engines in the rain, riding into the dark toward a fight they believed was righteous, on ground they believed was theirs. None of it was true. And in 3 days, Aiden would send his daughter walking down a street toward a man funded by someone who might already hold the weapon that could erase everything the Iron Circle had ever built. Not with fire, not with violence, but with a single piece of paper proving that the club's entire claim to its own home was built on a bribe that nobody at the table knew about, except Harlan. And now, Aiden. Friday came cold. Not autumn cold, the kind of cold that belongs to a season that hasn't decided what it wants to be yet, caught between dying and dead, the air carrying a metallic taste that settles on the tongue like a coin held too long in a fist. The sky was the color of old concrete, low and flat and pressing down on the town like a lid someone had placed over it to keep whatever was inside from escaping. Aiden hadn't told the club about Harlan's secret. He had carried it for 3 days the way a man carries a fracture he can't afford to have set, moving carefully, compensating with muscles that weren't designed for the load, feeling the edges grind against each other with every step. 3 days of looking at Harlan across the garage and knowing that the man who had stood with the club for 31 years had built its foundation on a lie, and that the lie was a ticking mechanism buried so deep in the structure that pulling it out might collapse everything built on top of it. But today was not the day for that demolition. Today was the day for Sadi. The route had been mapped, walked, driven, photographed, and memorized by every man in the club until it existed in their minds the way a heartbeat exists in a chest. Automatic, constant, running beneath every other thought. 6 blocks. Start point: the east entrance of Lincoln High School. Endpoint: the intersection of Miller and Caldwell, where the commercial district gave way to an industrial stretch of warehouses, auto shops, and empty lots surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with rust. The industrial stretch was Aiden's choice. Wide streets, low buildings, limited exits, good sightlines from the rooftops. A kill zone that didn't look like one until it was too late. 11 bikes were positioned before dawn. Not together. That would have been visible from a satellite, let alone from a gray van with a long-lens camera. They were scattered through a 7-block radius in 1s and 2s, parked behind dumpsters, inside open garages, in the lots of businesses that were closed for renovation or bankruptcy, or both. Each rider had a radio. Each radio was tuned to a frequency that Harlan had set up using equipment he'd acquired from a source he described only as a man who doesn't exist on paper anymore. Michelle was on the roof of a 3-story warehouse at the corner of Miller and 8th. The building had been a furniture distribution center before the company moved its operations south, and now it was just a shell, concrete floors, empty loading docks, and a roof access ladder that hadn't been inspected since the last administration. She had climbed it in the dark at 5:30 a.m. with a pair of binoculars around her neck, a radio in her jacket pocket, and the kind of calm on her face that comes from having spent your entire life preparing for moments that other people only experience in nightmares. Aiden had driven her there himself. They sat in the truck for 2 minutes before she got out, and he said the only thing he could think to say that was honest enough to matter. "If anything goes wrong, anything, you go down the ladder, out the back door, and you run south on 8th until you hit the gas station. You call 911 from the payphone. You tell them your name and where you are and nothing else." "I know." "Michelle." "I know, Aiden." She looked at him, and the look on her face wasn't the face of a 12-year-old girl. It was the face of someone who had learned a long time ago that safety is not a place you live in, but a thing you build in the seconds between one danger and the next. She got out, closed the door quietly, disappeared into the dark. Aiden sat in the truck and pressed his forehead against the steering wheel and breathed. In, out, in, out. The leather was cold against his skin. The engine ticked as it cooled. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded. 2 long blasts and a short one, the pattern so familiar it had become part of the town's heartbeat, unnoticed by everyone except the people who were awake at hours when no one should be. He started the truck and drove to position. The school day passed the way school days pass when you're counting minutes instead of living them. Slow, thick, each hour stretching like taffy pulled between hands that don't want to let go. Sadi sat in her classes and took notes she wouldn't read and answered questions she wouldn't remember and felt the weight of the evening pressing down on her shoulders, like a hand that kept getting heavier. At 3:15, she stood in the bathroom on the 2nd floor and looked at herself in the mirror. The face looking back was her mother's face. The same jaw. The same dark eyes that could go from warm to ice in the space between 2 words. The same way of holding the mouth. Not quite a frown, not quite anything else, just the neutral expression of a woman who had learned to keep her feelings behind her teeth until she decided they were worth releasing. She washed her hands, dried them on a paper towel that left brown fibers on her skin, picked up her green backpack with the band patch on the front pocket, walked downstairs. At 3:22, she pushed through the east doors and stepped into the cold. The gray van was there, same spot, same angle, same cracked window. She could see the outline of a figure behind the windshield, and she made herself not look at it, made herself walk the way she always walked, headphones in, eyes forward, shoulders pulled tight, because the plan only worked if everything looked the same, if the pattern held, if Calder Vance saw what he expected to see and followed the trail that had been laid for him without suspecting that this time the trail led somewhere he wouldn't come back from. She turned left, crossed at the Walgreens intersection, walked down Birch Avenue. Michelle's voice came through the radio, steady and clear, with the controlled flatness of someone reporting facts that her body wanted to scream. She's moving, normal pace, heading south on Birch. Aiden was parked in an alley off Miller, 2 blocks from the industrial stretch, sitting on his bike with the engine off and the radio in his left hand and his right hand gripping the handlebar so hard his knuckles had gone the color of bone. "Van," he said. "Pulling out. He's following. 3 blocks back. Same pattern." 3 blocks. That was Calder's distance. He always maintained 3 blocks. Close enough to see, far enough to disappear if the target turned around. The discipline of a man who had been doing this long enough to develop a method. Dutch's voice crackled through the radio from his position in a pickup on Caldwell. "I've got eyes on the south end. Streets clear. No civilian traffic." Roach. "In position. West side of Miller behind the body shop. Engines cold." Teague. A pause. Static. Then, north end of 8th. Ready. One by one the voices reported. 11 positions, 11 men. A perimeter that closed like a fist around 6 blocks of empty industrial road, waiting for 2 people to walk into it. One who knew she was bait, and one who thought he was the hunter. Sadi reached the edge of the commercial district and kept walking. The sidewalk changed beneath her feet, smooth concrete giving way to cracked asphalt, the streetlights spaced farther apart, the buildings lower and darker and less interested in pretending to be welcoming. She passed a tire shop with its gate pulled down, past a lot full of rusted shipping containers stacked 3 high, past the skeleton of a car wash that had closed 2 summers ago and now served only as a canvas for spray paint and a home for cats that nobody fed on purpose. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her ears. The headphones were playing nothing. They were props, part of the costume, connected to a phone that was powered off and sitting in the bottom of her backpack like a dead weight. The real sound was the radio earpiece hidden beneath her hair, and through it she could hear Michelle's breathing and the occasional click of binocular lenses being adjusted and the distant, almost subsonic hum of a dozen motorcycle engines waiting to fire. "He's closing," Michelle said. 2 blocks now. He's accelerating." Aiden's hand tightened on the radio. "Sadi, you hear that?" "I hear it." Her voice was quiet, steady, the voice of a girl who had spent 16 years learning how to hold herself together in rooms that were falling apart, and who had decided 3 days ago that she was done letting other people's wreckage dictate the shape of her life. "Stay on the route. Miller and Caldwell. When you reach the intersection, stop. Don't turn around. Don't look at the van. Stop and wait. I know the plan, Dad. I know you know the plan. Then stop talking and let me walk. A sound came through the radio that might have been a laugh, might have been something else. Aiden pressed the transmit button and released it without saying anything, which was its own kind of answer. The answer of a man who has just realized that his daughter is braver than he is and that the realization is both the proudest and most terrifying moment of his life. Sadi walked. The van followed. Michelle watched. The trap breathed. At 3:41, Sadi reached the intersection of Miller and Caldwell. She stopped, put her hands in her jacket pockets, stared straight ahead at the empty stretch of Warehouse Road that ran south toward the train tracks and the river and the edge of town where the streetlights ended and the dark began. Behind her, 2 blocks back, the gray van slowed, stopped. The engine idled. The windshield reflected the flat gray sky, turning Calder's face into a shadow behind a mirror. 10 seconds passed. 15. 20. He's not moving, Michelle said. Her voice had tightened, not panicked, adjusted. The voice of someone recalibrating in real time. He's sitting there, just sitting. He's reading the street, Harlan said through the radio. His voice was the quietest of all of them. Low, graveled, the voice of a man who had been in enough traps to know that the moment before they close is the moment everything can go wrong. He's looking for us, Teague said. He won't see us. Aiden's voice. Flat, certain. The certainty of a man who has bet everything he has on a single hand and has decided that doubt is a luxury he can't afford. 30 seconds. 40. Sadi stood at the intersection with her back to the van and her hands in her pockets and the cold pressing against her face, and she thought about her mother. Not the dying version, not the hospital version, the version from before. The version that used to stand at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee and look out the window at the morning and say, without turning around, "The world is full of people who wait for somebody else to go first, Sadi. Don't be one of them." She wasn't. He's moving, Michelle said. The van rolled forward, slow, deliberate, closing the 2-block gap at the pace of a man who has run the calculation and decided the odds are acceptable. 1 block, half a block. The engine sound grew. Not loud, not aggressive, just the steady mechanical breathing of a vehicle carrying a man towards something he believed he controlled. He pulled to the curb 30 feet behind Sadi. The engine cut. The driver's door opened, and Calder Vance stepped out. He was bigger than the photograph suggested, taller, wider through the shoulders, with the kind of mass that comes from years of controlled violence. Not gym muscle, not vanity, but the functional bulk of a man who has learned that size is a tool and has maintained it the way he maintains his other tools, carefully, purposefully, without wasted motion. The snake tattoo was visible on his forearm below his rolled sleeve. The scar ran from his jaw into his collar exactly as Michelle had described it. His eyes were fixed on Sadi's back, and they carried the flat, patient intensity of a predator that has finally decided the distance is short enough. He took a step, 2, 3. "Now," Aiden said. The word was quiet, almost gentle, the kind of word you use to wake someone from a sleep they don't want to leave. And then the world exploded. 11 engines fired simultaneously. The sound was not a roar. It was a detonation, a wall of mechanical thunder that erupted from every direction at once, from alleys and garages and parking lots and loading docks, converging on the intersection of Miller and Caldwell like a shockwave radiating inward instead of out. Headlights blazed to life in the gray afternoon, cutting through the flat light like searchlights hitting a stage, and every beam pointed at the same spot, the 30 feet of cracked asphalt between a gray van and a 16-year-old girl who had stopped walking. Calder froze. The instinct hit him before the thought. The animal recognition that the ground beneath his feet had changed, that the empty street he had calculated and memorized and trusted was no longer empty, that the silence he had mistaken for safety was actually the held breath of something about to close its jaws. He turned. Bikes behind him. He turned again. Bikes on his left. On his right. In front of him, past Sadi, 2 more headlights swinging into position at the end of the road like the final teeth in a mouth that had just finished opening. Chrome and steel and leather and the deep guttural idle of engines built to move weight at speed. And behind every handlebar, a man with a face that had been carved by years of carrying things that couldn't be put down. Aiden rode in from the east. He didn't rush. He brought the bike to a stop 20 feet from Calder, killed the engine, swung his leg over, and stood in the headlight wash with his shadow stretching long and black across the wet asphalt. His face was empty. Not calm. Empty. The face of a man who has crossed a threshold and left every version of himself that hesitates on the other side. "You remember this feeling?" Aiden said. "You should. You felt it 4 years ago, right before we took your patch." Calder's head swiveled, counting bikes, counting men, counting exits that didn't exist anymore. His hand dropped to his waistband, and two things happened in the same second. Dutch stepped off his bike and closed the distance to Calder's right side with 3 long strides, and Roach appeared on his left, and both men were close enough to breathe on him before his hand reached whatever it was reaching for. "Don't," Dutch said. One word. The word carried the weight of a man who had spent 19 years in a club that solved problems without raising its voice, and the promise inside that word was as real as the ground they were standing on. Calder's hand stopped, hovered, dropped to his side. "Funny," Calder said. His voice was rougher than Aiden expected, deeper, worn down at the edges like a blade that had been sharpened too many times. 11 guys, 11 bikes. All this for me?" "Not for you," Aiden said. "You're the delivery system. I want to talk about who sent you." Something moved behind Calder's eyes. A flicker, fast. The kind of movement you see in a man's face when a piece of information lands that he didn't expect, and his brain has to decide in a fraction of a second whether to absorb it or deflect it. He deflected. "Nobody sent me. I'm here because your club broke my ribs and threw me out like garbage, and I've been thinking about that every day for 4 years. 4 years is a long time to think about ribs. 4 years is a long time to sit in a room and plan. A room at the Ridgeline Motel, paid for with cash from a company called Linden Property Holdings. You want to keep talking about how nobody sent you, or do you want to have an honest conversation for the first time in your life?" The flicker again, longer this time. Calder's jaw worked. His eyes shifted from Aiden to Dutch to Roach to the circle of bikes surrounding him, and the calculation that ran behind his face was visible, the rapid, desperate math of a man who has just realized he is not holding the cards he thought he was holding. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ward Sable, Linden Property Holdings, the garage, the land, the 8-year grudge he's been nursing since we beat him in court. You're his weapon, Calder. You're the thing he pointed at my family because he couldn't buy what he wanted with money. You're insane. I'm a lot of things. Insane isn't one of them. And you're standing in the middle of 11 men who know exactly what you are, so I suggest you stop performing and start explaining. Sadie had turned around. She was standing 15 feet behind Aiden, watching. Her face was her mother's face. The same locked jaw, the same dark eyes holding something behind them that was either fury or fear, or the place where those two things meet and become something else entirely. Michelle's voice came through the earpiece. Quiet, tense. "Aiden, black sedan, east on Miller, moving fast." The temperature in Aiden's blood dropped 10 degrees. The sedan, Linden Property Holdings, the same car that had visited Calder's motel room 4 days ago. It was here, which meant Sable, or whoever Sable sent, was here, which meant the trap had caught more than one animal. "Dutch," Aiden said without turning his head. "Sedan, east on Miller, incoming." Dutch didn't respond with words. He moved, 3 strides to his bike, engine, headlight. He swung into the street facing east and planted himself in the center of the road like a wall made of one man and 900 pounds of iron. The sedan appeared at the end of the block, headlights cutting through the gray light, moving fast, then slowing, then stopping, 50 feet from Dutch, the engine idling, the tinted windshield reflecting nothing. For 10 seconds, nothing moved. The street was a frozen tableau, 11 bikes in a circle, a gray van at the center, a black sedan at the edge, and in the spaces between them, the accumulated weight of 8 years of silence and 4 years of planning and 14 months of grief and 6 days of fear, all pressing down on the asphalt like gravity had doubled. Then the sedan door opened. The man who stepped out was not Ward Sable. He was younger, sharper, wearing a dark coat that probably cost more than any single bike on the street. His shoes were wrong for the neighborhood. Polished, pointed, designed for floors that were always clean. He stood beside the sedan with one hand on the roof and scanned the scene with the efficient, unhurried gaze of a man evaluating a business problem. "Which one of you is Cross?" he said. "Who's asking?" "My name is Garrett Penn. I represent Mr. Sable's interests in this area, and what I'm looking at right now is 11 men illegally detaining a private citizen on a public street, which is a scenario that generates a great deal of paperwork for people like me." His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who understood that words, arranged properly, could do more damage than fists. Aiden stepped toward him, not fast, not threatening, just closing the distance enough that the conversation became personal instead of public. "Your client hired a convicted violent offender to stalk a 16-year-old girl. Your client funded the surveillance. Your client is using a man with a history of assault against women as a tool to intimidate a motorcycle club into abandoning property your client has been trying to acquire for 8 years. Those are serious allegations. They're not allegations, they're facts. We have the plate on that sedan. We have photographs of your associate entering Calder's motel room. We have the note he left inside a minor's school locker. And we have a 12-year-old eyewitness who has been documenting every single day of this operation since before we even knew it was happening." Penn's face didn't change. The professional mask held, but his hand on the sedan's roof shifted, just slightly, just enough to show that the metal beneath his fingers was no longer something he was leaning on casually, but something he was gripping. "Mr. Sable has no connection to Mr. Vance. Linden Property Holdings paid for his motel room. Linden Property Holdings is a real estate entity with hundreds of tenants and transactions. A motel billing error hardly constitutes. It's not a billing error when your man visits the room in person. 14 minutes, broad daylight, photographed." The mask cracked, just a hairline. Just enough to see the calculation running behind it. The same calculation Calder had run 60 seconds ago. The realization that the ground was not solid, that the plan had holes, that the 11 men standing in the cold were not the disorganized, emotional, easily manipulated targets they had been described as in whatever briefing Penn had received before driving out here. Michelle's voice came through the earpiece again. "Aiden! Police scanner. Someone called it in. Units dispatched. 8 minutes. 8 minutes." The clock started. Aiden looked at Penn, looked at Calder, looked at the circle of bikes and the men on them and the gray sky pressing down and the cold air carrying the sound of distant trains and the taste of metal and exhaust and rain that hadn't started yet but wanted to. "Here's what's going to happen," Aiden said. "In about 8 minutes, police are going to arrive at this intersection. When they do, they're going to find a man," he pointed at Calder, "who has been stalking a minor for over a week. They're going to find a threatening note left in that minor's locked school locker. They're going to find surveillance photographs. They're going to find a motel room paid for by your client's company. And they're going to find a 12-year-old girl who noticed what every adult in this town failed to notice and had the guts to do something about it." He stepped closer to Penn, close enough that Penn could smell the coffee and leather and cold sweat of a man who hadn't slept properly in a week. "Or you can get in that sedan, drive back to wherever Sable is sitting right now, and tell him that the Iron Circle is not for sale. The garage is not for sale. The land is not for sale. And if he sends another man near my daughter, near any of our families, the next conversation won't happen on a street. It'll happen in a courtroom, with every photograph and every document and every piece of evidence we've collected spread across a table where a judge can see it." Penn's eyes narrowed. The calculation finished. The answer arrived. "You're bluffing," he said. "You don't want a courtroom. A courtroom means discovery. Discovery means someone looks at how your club acquired that property in the first place. And I suspect that's a conversation your people would prefer to avoid." The words landed like a blade between Aiden's ribs. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. But inside his chest, the fracture he'd been carrying for 3 days, Harlan's secret, the bribed judge, the hollow foundation, ground against itself and sent a bolt of pain through every structure built on top of it. Penn knew Sable knew. They had always known. Behind him, Aiden heard Harlan's breathing change. The old man was standing beside his bike, 20 feet back, and the sound of his breath was the sound of a man watching the detonation he'd been dreading for 8 years finally arrive. 6 minutes until police. Calder saw the crack, saw the hesitation, and he moved. It happened fast. Faster than strategy, faster than planning, faster than any calculation running in any brain on that street. Calder's right hand came out of his waistband with a folding knife, blade already open, and he didn't run for the exit or the van or the sedan. He ran toward Sadi, because that had always been the point. Not leverage, not information, not tactical advantage. The point was the girl. The point was Aiden's daughter standing 15 feet away with her mother's face and her father's stubbornness. And Calder Vance had spent 4 years in a room thinking about the man who broke his ribs, and the only way to break him back was to take the one thing he couldn't replace. Sadi saw the knife. Her body locked. Her feet wouldn't move. Every signal her brain sent to her legs disappeared into the static of pure animal terror, the kind of fear that doesn't think, doesn't plan, doesn't calculate, just floods every nerve with the single blinding instruction to survive without telling you how. Aiden moved. He didn't think about it. Didn't calculate distance or angle or risk. His body moved the way bodies move when the only thing between your child and a blade is the space you haven't crossed yet. 3 strides, 4. He hit Calder from the side at full momentum, and the impact was the sound of 2 men colliding with the combined force of gravity and desperation and 4 years of hatred meeting 14 months of grief. They hit the van. The metal buckled. The mirror snapped off and skittered across the asphalt. Calder's back slammed against the driver's door, and the window cracked in a spiderweb pattern, and Aiden's hands found the wrist holding the knife, and he squeezed with everything he had left, which was everything he was. Calder fought. He was younger, stronger in the way that rage keeps men strong when their bodies want to quit. He twisted, got his free hand around Aiden's throat, squeezed. Aiden felt his vision narrow, the edges going dark, the center going bright, the world shrinking to a tunnel that contained only Calder's face and the knife and the sound of his own pulse hammering in his ears like a drum being beaten by someone who wanted to break the skin. He slammed his forehead into Calder's nose. The cartilage gave. Blood sprayed across both their faces, hot and copper-smelling, and the hand on Aiden's throat loosened for half a second, long enough for him to drive his knee into Calder's ribs, the same ribs the club had broken 4 years ago, and the sound Calder made was not a scream but something deeper, something pulled from the bottom of a well that had been holding 4 years of pain. The knife clattered to the asphalt. Dutch was there. Roach was there. Hands grabbed Calder's arms, his legs, his shoulders. He went down hard, face against the wet ground, and 3 men held him there while he screamed and thrashed and bled from the nose, and the street absorbed all of it without comment. Aiden staggered backward. His throat burned. His hands were shaking. His forehead was split where it had connected with Calder's face, and blood ran down his brow and into his left eye, turning half the world red. Sadi was standing where she had been standing the whole time. She hadn't moved. Her face was white. Her hands were fists at her sides, and she was staring at her father with an expression that contained everything she had been unable to say for 14 months. The anger and the grief and the abandonment and the fear, and underneath all of it, buried so deep she hadn't known it was still there, the thing that hurt the most. Love, the kind that survives everything, even silence. "Dad," she said. The word broke him. Not the fight, not the knife, not the blood or the cold or the 8 minutes that were now 4 minutes and counting. The word, that word, the one she hadn't used in 14 months, the one that landed in his chest and cracked open everything he had been holding shut since the hospital room and the machines and the last breath. "I'm here," he said. Sirens, distant but growing. The sound cutting through the engine noise and the rain that had finally started, and the breathing of 11 men standing in a circle around a fallen predator and the 2 people he had come to destroy. Garrett Penn was already in the sedan. The door closed. The engine started. The tires hissed on the wet asphalt as the car reversed, turned, and accelerated east on Miller. disappearing into the gray afternoon like a shadow returning to the wall it had been cast from. But Aiden had seen his face through the windshield in the last second before the turn, and the expression on that face was not defeat, it was recalculation. The cold, efficient adjustment of a man who has lost a piece but not the game, and who already knows which move comes next. 3 minutes until police. Aiden turned to Harlan. Blood in his eye, rain on his face, his voice raw and torn and carrying the weight of everything he now knew and everything he was about to decide. "When the police get here," he said, "we tell them everything." Harlan went pale. "Aiden, everything. Calder, the note, the surveillance, Linden Property Holdings, the photographs." He paused. The rain ran down his jaw and dripped off his chin and hit the asphalt between his boots. "And the ruling. 8 years ago. The bribe. All of it. That destroys us." "No, that destroys the lie. The club survives because the club is not a building, it's not a foundation, it's not a piece of paper with a judge's signature on it. The club is the 11 men standing on this street right now, and the 2 girls who had the guts to stand with them." Harlan's hands were shaking. His face was old, older than 56. The face of a man watching the thing he built to protect everyone he loved being dismantled by the one person he trusted most. "You'll lose the garage," he said. "Maybe. Probably. But I'll keep my daughter, and I'll keep looking every man at that table in the eye. And that's worth more than any piece of dirt in any county in any state." 2 minutes. Sirens louder now, close, blue and red flashing off the wet buildings at the end of the block, the lights bouncing and scattering in the rain like signals from something approaching that couldn't be stopped and couldn't be negotiated with, and didn't care about history or loyalty or the difference between a lie told to save something and a lie told to steal it. Sadi walked forward, took her father's hand. His knuckles were split and bleeding, and his grip was weak from the fight, but he held on, and she held on, and they stood together in the rain with the sirens coming and the circle closing, and the truth, all of it, every ugly piece, about to be laid bare. Michelle's voice came through the earpiece one last time. Quiet, certain, 12 years old and already carrying the weight of someone who has seen the worst of what people do and decided to stand in front of it anyway. "They're here." The police cruisers came in pairs, 4 of them, lights cycling blue and red through the rain, tires hissing on the wet asphalt as they pulled to stops at staggered angles across the intersection of Miller and Caldwell. Doors opened. Officers emerged into the cold with hands already on holsters, and voices already giving commands that bounced off the warehouse walls and came back distorted, overlapping, turning the street into an echo chamber of authority, arriving late to a problem that had already been solved. Calder Vance was face down on the pavement, with 3 men holding him still, and blood from his broken nose spreading into the rainwater in a thin pink river that nobody was watching. He had stopped struggling. The fight had left him the way fights leave men who realized that the thing they were fighting for was never going to be theirs. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a slow mechanical shutdown, like a machine running out of fuel one system at a time. Aiden stepped forward. Blood in his left eye, split knuckle on his right hand, rain running down his leather jacket in channels that followed the creases and seams the way water follows the path of least resistance, which is the only path water knows. The first officer was a woman named Ruiz, mid-30s. Short hair, eyes that moved fast and missed nothing. She took in the scene, the bikes, the van, the man on the ground, the blood, the 16-year-old girl standing behind a man who looked like he'd just walked out of something that tried to kill him. And she made the calculation that every officer makes in the first 3 seconds of arriving at a situation they didn't create. Who is the threat? Who is the victim? And where is the line between the two? "Hands where I can see them," she said. "All of you." 11 men raised their hands. The gesture was slow, deliberate. Not surrender. Compliance. The distinction matters when you're standing in the rain with split knuckles and a circle of chrome and steel behind you, and the weight of a decision that will determine whether the next hour of your life is spent in a squad car standing upright. Aiden spoke first. His voice was steady, raw at the edges from the choking and the cold and the accumulated strain of a week that had taken more from him than any single week should be allowed to take from a man who was still standing. "The man on the ground is Calder Vance. He has been stalking my daughter for at least 10 days. He left a threatening note inside her school locker. He is a convicted violent offender who was exiled from this club 4 years ago for assault. He is being funded and directed by a man named Ward Sable, operating through a company called Linden Property Holdings, as part of a campaign to force this club off its property. He paused, breathed. The rain hit his face and he let it. We have photographs, license plates, eyewitness testimony from a minor who first identified the surveillance pattern, a threatening note preserved in its original condition, and documentation connecting Sable's company to Vance's accommodations and movements over the past 2 weeks. Ruiz listened. Her partner, a man named Torrance, who was built like a filing cabinet and had the expression to match, was already moving toward Calder with handcuffs. And the altercation? Ruiz asked, nodding toward Aiden's face. He pulled a knife, charged my daughter. I intercepted him. Where's the knife? Dutch pointed to the asphalt 3 feet from the van's front tire. The folding knife lay in a shallow puddle, blade open, the steel catching the cycling blue and red lights in a way that made it look like it was still moving. Ruiz's eyes went from the knife to Sadi to Aiden to the circle of bikes and back to Calder, and the calculation behind her expression shifted. The line between threat and victim rearranged itself, and Aiden watched it happen and said nothing, because the truth doesn't need a salesman. It just needs someone willing to look at it without flinching. What happened next took 4 hours. Calder was loaded into a cruiser. Statements were taken from every man on the street, one at a time, in the backs of squad cars and under the awning of the abandoned car wash, where the rain was lighter and the cats watched from the shadows with the indifferent patience of creatures who had seen humans do worse. Sadi gave her statement sitting in the passenger seat of Ruiz's cruiser with the heater running and a blanket around her shoulders that an EMT had produced from somewhere. She spoke clearly. She spoke completely. She did not cry, and she did not exaggerate. And when Ruiz asked if she wanted a parent or guardian present, Sadi looked through the windshield at the street where her father was standing in the rain giving his own statement and said, "He's right there. He's been right there the whole time. I just couldn't see it." Michelle gave her statement last. She came down from the rooftop at Ruiz's request, climbing the ladder in the rain with the binoculars still around her neck and the radio still in her pocket. And she sat on a crate inside the warehouse loading dock and told Ruiz everything she had seen from the first day outside Lincoln High to the last transmission she had made from the rooftop 40 minutes ago. Ruiz listened to the 12-year-old girl describe 10 days of surveillance conducted on her own initiative, without resources, without support, without a single adult in her life noticing or caring, and when Michelle was finished, Ruiz closed her notebook and sat still for a long time. "Who is your legal guardian?" Ruiz asked. "The state." "Is there someone at your group home I should call?" "There's a house manager. Her name is Mrs. Kessler. She does bed checks at 9. She probably hasn't noticed I'm gone." Ruiz closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, something had changed behind them. Not professionally, personally. The shift that happens when a law enforcement officer encounters a gap in the system that she swore to serve and realizes the gap is not a bug, but a feature. "I'm going to make sure someone notices," Ruiz said. The charges were filed by morning. Calder Vance was held without bail on stalking, criminal threatening, menacing, and attempted assault with a deadly weapon. The note from Sadi's locker was entered into evidence. The photographs were submitted. The license plates were traced and logged. Linden Property Holdings was flagged for investigation, and a detective named Corrado was assigned to follow the money from the shell company to Ward Sable's office on the 3rd floor of a building in Carver that had tinted windows and a receptionist who was trained to say, "Mr. Sable is not available," in 11 different ways. Sable would not be arrested that week, or the week after. The machinery of financial crime investigation moves at the speed of paperwork, which is the speed of molasses running uphill in January. But the investigation was open, the thread was being pulled, and Sable, for the first time in 20 years, was no longer invisible. Aiden made good on his word. 3 days after the arrest, he sat in a room at the county district attorney's office with a lawyer the club couldn't afford and a story the club couldn't survive, and he told them about the ruling, 8 years ago. The land dispute, the bribed judge, Harlan's secret, Every detail delivered in the same flat, stripped voice he used when he was standing at the corkboard in the garage. No emotion, no embellishment, just the facts laid out on the table like parts pulled from a broken engine. The lawyer looked at him like he had just set fire to his own house. "You understand what this means," the lawyer said. "I do. The ruling will be vacated, the property reverts, your club loses the garage." "I know. And the member who arranged the bribe, Harlan, you said, he could face charges." Aiden paused. This was the part he had been carrying since the farmhouse, the part that weighed more than the fight, more than the knife, more than the blood on the asphalt. Harlan had broken the law to save the club. The club was everything Harlan had, and now Aiden was about to take both of those things away from a man who had been standing beside him for longer than most marriages last. "Harlan will be here tomorrow," Aiden said. "He'll give his own statement, his choice, his words." And he did. Harlan sat in the same chair the next morning, wearing a clean shirt and his reading glasses and the expression of a man who has been waiting for a roof to fall and has finally heard the first crack in the beam. He told the truth. All of it. The lawyer, the judge, the money, the years of silence. When he was finished, he folded his hands on the table and looked at the district attorney and said, "I did what I thought would save the people I love. I was wrong about the method. I wasn't wrong about the reason." The DA offered a deal. Cooperation in the investigation into Sable's broader property acquisition practices, including evidence of other bribed officials, other shell companies, other communities that had been squeezed in exchange for a reduced charge. Harlan took it. He would not see the inside of a prison cell. He would lose his clean record, which had never been entirely clean anyway, and he would carry the mark of it for the rest of his life, which was a punishment that fit a man who had always defined himself by the things he carried. The garage was lost. The ruling was vacated in early November, and the property reverted to the original owner who sold it to Linden Property Holdings within 72 hours. Sable got his dirt. He got his square footage. He got the foundation that Harlan had poured 34 years ago, and the walls that had absorbed 3 decades of engine noise and cigarette smoke, and the quiet conversations of men who had nowhere else to go. What he didn't get was the club. Dutch's uncle's farmhouse, 20 acres of scrub grass and a well that still worked, became the new home of the Iron Circle. It took 2 weeks and every pair of hands in the club to make it livable. They cleaned the kitchen, replaced the warped window frame, ran electrical to the barn, which became the new garage. They moved the tools, the workbenches, the plywood table on sawhorses, the corkboard that Aiden stripped bare and left empty because the pictures that had been pinned to it belonged to a chapter that was over. The farmhouse was smaller, colder, farther from town. The drive was 22 minutes on a good day and 35 on a bad one, and the road that led to it was unpaved for the last mile, which meant mud in the rain and dust in the dry and the constant low-grade annoyance of a commute that nobody had asked for. But the table fit, and the men fit around it. And on the first night they sat together in the kitchen, with the new bulb casting clean white light on the old wood surface, Teague looked around the room and said, "It's smaller." "Yeah," Aiden said. "Smells like pipe tobacco." "Yeah, I kind of like it." Nobody laughed, but something moved through the room that was close to laughter. A release, a softening, the exhaled breath of 11 men realizing that the thing they were afraid of losing was never the building. Aiden and Sadi did not fix their relationship in a day. They did not fix it in a week. They did not sit at the kitchen table and have a conversation that resolved 14 months of silence with the efficiency of a screenplay that needs to wrap up before the credits roll. What they did was smaller than that, harder than that, more honest than that. Aiden started cooking. Not well. Not at first. He burned rice. He oversalted pasta. He once produced a chicken breast so dry that Sadi picked it up, held it at arm's length, and said, "This could be used as a weapon." And Aiden said, "I have been in a knife fight this month, and that is still the most violent thing I've seen in this kitchen." And Sadi laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in his presence since before the hospital. The sound was small, brief, over before it fully arrived. But it happened, and they both heard it, and neither of them mentioned it because mentioning it would have made it fragile, and some things need to be left alone so they can grow roots. He started driving her to school. Not every day. Some days she wanted to walk. Some days she needed the silence and the cold air and the rhythm of her own footsteps to organize the thoughts that accumulated overnight like snow on a windshield. But some days she got in the truck and they rode together without talking, the radio playing something neither of them was listening to, the heater rattling the way it always rattled, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of two people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who had everything to say, and were learning, slowly, painfully, clumsily, that some of the most important things can only be said by showing up. He turned the calendar page. September, October, November. Each month revealed and acknowledged. The small act of moving forward measured in paper and time. Michelle's case moved through the system the way all cases involving children move through the system. Slowly, impersonally, handled by people who cared about outcomes in the abstract, but had caseloads that made the abstract very difficult to translate into the specific. But Ruiz had made a call, and the call had reached a social worker named Danielle Price, who had a reputation for being the kind of person who remembered names after the files were closed and who did not accept "the system is overwhelmed" as an explanation for why a 12-year-old girl who had demonstrated more courage and clarity than most adults was still sleeping in a group home where nobody noticed when she left and nobody asked where she'd been. The process took 2 months. There were interviews, background checks, home visits, paperwork that required signatures from people who were never in their offices when you needed them to be. The bureaucracy did what bureaucracy does. It moved at the speed of institutions, which is the speed of a glacier that has been told it's late but doesn't understand the concept. But it moved. In early December, Michelle was placed with a family. The family was not perfect. No family is. The father was a mechanic named Gil who worked at an auto shop on Route 4 and had hands that were permanently stained with grease and a voice that was quiet, the way functional quiet is. Not silence, not absence, just the restrained volume of a man who understood that children who have been yelled at don't need more volume. The mother was a woman named Pam, who worked as a school librarian and who, upon learning that Michelle had a library card that had been used more than 300 times in 6 years, sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Tell me your top 5, we'll start there." Michelle moved in on a Wednesday. She had one bag. Everything she owned fit inside it, which is a sentence that should break your heart if you let it. Aiden drove her. They sat in the truck in front of Gil and Pam's house for 2 minutes, the engine idling, the heater rattling. Michelle stared at the house through the windshield. It was small, white siding, a porch with a railing that had been recently painted, a light in the front window that was on even though it was the middle of the afternoon, which meant someone had left it on that morning without thinking about it, which meant the house was the kind of place where lights got left on because the people inside were thinking about other things, normal things, the kinds of things that people think about when their lives are stable enough to be careless with electricity. "It's small," Michelle said. "Yeah. The porch railing is new." "Looks like it." "They painted it for me. You can tell because the paint on the railing doesn't match the paint on the steps. The steps are old. The railing is new. They painted it because someone was coming." Aiden looked at her. 12 years old, eyes that never stopped working. A brain that cataloged details the way other children cataloged baseball cards or song lyrics. Compulsively, automatically, because noticing things had been the difference between safety and danger for so long that she couldn't turn it off. "Someone was coming," he said. "You." "Me." She picked up the bag, opened the door, stopped. "Aiden." "Yeah. Thank you for not making this weird. I don't know what that means. It means thank you for driving me here and sitting in the truck and not giving a speech about new beginnings or whatever. It means thank you for treating me like a person who can walk into a house by herself." She got out, closed the door, walked up the path to the porch with the new railing. The front door opened before she reached it, and Pam was standing there, and Pam didn't say anything dramatic or emotional or designed to make the moment feel bigger than it was. She just stepped aside and held the door and said, "Your room is on the left. I put extra blankets on the bed because the heater takes a while to warm up that side of the house." Michelle walked in. The door closed. Aiden sat in the truck for 3 minutes. Then he drove away. The investigation into Ward Sable continued through the winter. Detective Corrado was methodical, patient, and deeply unimpressed by men in expensive shoes who used shell companies to hide the trail between their ambitions and the damage those ambitions caused. The thread that started with Linden Property Holdings led to 4 other companies, 3 other counties, and a pattern of property acquisition that involved intimidation, bribery, and the systematic targeting of communities too small or too poor to fight back. Sable's attorney filed motions, delayed hearings, produced documents that contradicted other documents. The legal process was slow and expensive and designed to exhaust the people pursuing it, which was exactly what men like Sable counted on. The assumption that justice had a price tag, and if you made the price high enough, most people would stop paying. But Corrado didn't stop, and the photographs Dutch had taken didn't disappear. And the testimony of a 12-year-old girl who had walked 40 minutes in the dark to tell strangers that something was wrong sat in the case file like an anchor, holding the whole thing in place against every current that tried to move it. In February, Sable was indicted on 3 counts of conspiracy, 2 counts of witness intimidation, and 1 count of criminal solicitation in connection with the Calder Vance operation. The indictment would not bring back the garage. It would not undo the years of silence between a father and his daughter, or the 6 years a girl had spent in a system that valued paperwork over people. But it placed a marker in the ground, a public permanent statement that what happened on the corner of Miller and Caldwell was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a consequence. Calder Vance pleaded guilty in March. He received 7 years. He would serve them in a facility 3 states away, in a cell that was smaller than the room he had rented at the Ridgeline Motel, and the distance between where he was and where Sadie Cole walked to school every morning would be measured in hundreds of miles, and the absolute certainty that the 11 men on motorcycles would be watching for the rest of their lives. Spring came late that year, the kind of spring that doesn't announce itself with warmth or color, but simply stops being winter one morning, the air losing its edge, the ground softening beneath boots that have been walking on frozen earth for months. The trees along Route 11 budded without fanfare. The river south of town thawed and carried the winter's debris downstream in a slow brown current that took everything that had been frozen and set it moving again. On a Saturday morning in April, the Iron Circle gathered at the farmhouse. Not for a meeting, not for a vote, not for a crisis or a plan or a decision that would keep anyone awake at 3 in the morning. They gathered because the barn needed a new door, and the door needed 12 hands to lift it. And when it was hung and the hinges were tested and the door swung open on the first try, Roach stepped back and looked at it and said, "That's the best door I've ever hung." And Dutch said, "That's the only door you've ever hung." And the laughter that followed was the real kind. The kind that comes from men who have been through something together and survived it and are standing on the other side in the sunlight with grease on their hands and sawdust in their hair. And the knowledge that the building they are standing in was not given to them and was not taken from anyone. It was built. By them. With their own hands. On ground that nobody could take away because nobody had to lie to keep it. Aiden sat on the porch after the others had gone inside for coffee. The sun was low in the west, painting the 20 acres of scrub grass in shades of gold and amber that made the landscape look like something from a painting or a memory, or the kind of dream you have when you finally slept after a long time of not sleeping. Sadie's truck pulled up the gravel drive. She had gotten her license in March, passed on the first try, which she mentioned exactly once, and which Aiden had celebrated by leaving a small wrapped gift on the kitchen counter the next morning. Not money. A keychain. Simple. Metal. The letter S in a font that looked like something hammered by hand. She carried it on her keys every day and never mentioned it, which was exactly the right response because some gifts are not meant to be discussed. They are meant to be carried. She got out of the truck, walked to the porch, sat down next to him on the step. "Michelle called," she said. "She wants to come out next Saturday. Gil said he'd drive her." "Good." "She's reading a lot. Pam has her on some kind of list system, 5 books a month. She's on book 7, and it's April 12th. "Sounds right." They sat. The sun moved. The golden light stretched across the scrub grass and reached the edge of the barn where the new door stood closed and solid in its frame. "Dad?" "Yeah." "I'm not going to say it's okay. What happened? The 14 months. The silence. I'm not going to say it's okay because it wasn't. I know. But I'm here, and I'm going to keep being here. And that's what I've got right now. Aiden nodded. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't put his arm around her shoulders. He didn't say anything that a screenwriter would put in the mouth of a father trying to redeem himself in 2 sentences. He just sat beside his daughter on the porch of a farmhouse that smelled like sawdust and coffee and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco, and he let the silence between them be what it was. Not empty, not full, but present. The silence of 2 people who are learning to sit in the same space without needing to fill it with anything other than the fact of being there. Inside the farmhouse, someone turned on the radio. An old song. Something with a guitar and a voice that sounded like it had been used hard and put away wet. The music drifted through the open window and settled over the porch like a blanket that nobody had asked for, but nobody was going to take off. Aiden heard the bikes before he saw them. 2 of them coming up the gravel road, the sound deep and familiar. The exhaled breath of engines built to carry weight over distance. The mechanical heartbeat of machines that don't care about the past and don't promise anything about the future, but are always, always moving forward. Dutch and Teague, riding side by side. They pulled up to the farmhouse and killed their engines and sat for a moment in the sudden silence that follows the death of a Harley motor. The silence that is not absence but echo, the ghost of sound still vibrating in the air after the source has stopped. Teague swung off his bike, looked at Aiden on the porch, looked at Sadi beside him. "Door looks good," Teague said. "Ro chung it." "First time for everything?" He walked past them into the farmhouse. Dutch followed. The screen door closed behind them with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Sadi leaned back on her hands and looked up at the sky, which was turning from gold to something deeper, something that didn't have a name in any language she knew, but that felt like the color you'd get if you mixed exhaustion with relief, with the first unguarded breath after a long time of holding everything in. "Dad?" "Yeah." "The keychain, the one you left on the counter." "What about it?" "I know you didn't buy it. I know you made it. I found the file marks on the workbench in the barn." Aiden said nothing. His jaw tightened, not in anger, in the thing that lives next door to anger but pays different rent. The thing that men feel when they have been seen doing something tender and don't know how to survive the exposure. "It's good," Sadi said. "The metalwork, it's not perfect. The curve on the bottom of the S is a little uneven, but it's good." "Thanks." "You're welcome." The sun touched the horizon. The light went from gold to copper to rust. Inside the farmhouse, the radio played. Coffee was poured. Men's voices mixed with the music in a low, steady murmur that sounded like the engine of something that was running and would keep running, not because it was new or perfect or unbroken, but because the people who built it knew how to work with what they had. Aiden sat on the porch with his daughter beside him and the sound of his brothers behind him and the knowledge that the road ahead was unpaved and long and would ask more of him than he wanted to give on most days. But the road was there, and the people on it were real, and the house at the end of it, imperfect, cold on the left side, smelling of pipe tobacco and sawdust, was not a house that had been stolen or bought or won through a lie told in a courtroom. It was a house that had been chosen. By people who had learned the hard way that family is not the thing you're born into. It is the thing you build when the thing you were born into falls apart. It is the 12-year-old girl who walks 40 minutes in the dark to tell strangers the truth. It is the 16-year-old girl who stands on a street corner as bait because she trusts her father to be there when it matters. It is the man who breaks his own foundation to keep his house honest. It is the brotherhood that loses its home and builds another one, slower and smaller and further from town, with a door that swings true on its hinges because the people who hung it cared enough to get it right. The last light faded. The stars came on, one by one, the way they always do, without permission, without audience, without caring whether anyone is watching. Aiden watched them. Sadi watched them. And somewhere on the other side of town, in a small house with a porch railing that had been painted new for her arrival, a 12-year-old girl sat at a kitchen table with a book open in front of her and a glass of milk that someone had poured without being asked, reading by the light that someone had left on that morning without thinking about it. Because in this house, lights were left on. Because in this house, Someone was always expected to come home,